Hello and welcome to Tales from the Hangman's Record. In this series we look back at a variety of true crimes that took place in Great Britain and Ireland between 1868 and 1964. Some of the cases will be familiar to many, while others will be new to all but the most ardent criminologist. All feature in my 3-volume hardback book series, The Hangman's Record. Copies of these books and information on all my other titles and links to previous videos in the series can be found on my website stevefielding.com. If you wish to help offset the cost of running the channel, donations are greatly appreciated. You can help by clicking the thanks button below the video or using the link paypal.me/thehangmansrecord. I have tried to thank everyone personally who has contributed so far, so apologies if I have missed anyone. Finally, if you don't already, can I ask you please to subscribe to the channel, give the video a like, and if you can share it on your social media, that will be most appreciated. And as before, use the comments below for your thoughts on the case and whether you believe justice was done. Partner in crime, accessory, willing accomplice, common design. The terms are many. In previous episodes of Tales from the Hangman's Record, we have looked at cases where there have been more than one protagonist. Some, like the Stratton brothers in 1905, Appleby and Osler and Jenkins and Garrity in the 1940s, and Pascoe and Whitty in 1963, were clearly equally guilty, and little was made to spur one above the other. In the case of Forsyth and Harris, hanged in 1960, which we looked at in episode 15, it could be argued that while one was clearly guilty of committing murder, the other was convicted more on a technicality, while the real instigator of the attack, also found guilty of capital murder, was too young to hang. In other cases of two suspects tried together, we have seen some controversial outcomes, with reprieves granted in the case of Herbert Ridley in 1930, and in 1913 when Ernie Kelly and Edward Hilton were convicted of the murder of Hilton's employer. It was Kelly at 20 years of age who was hanged, while recently turned 18 Hilton was reprieved, despite many believing he was far more guilty of the two. Today's episode takes us back to December 1913, 1 week before Ernie Kelly went to the gallows, and a brutal case that had many similarities to the one 40 miles away to the west. It was just after 7:30, Wednesday evening the 10th of December 1913, and a cold wind was blowing down Old Hall Street, a few hundred yards from Liverpool's Pier Head in the northwest of England. Ship steward Walter Eves, on shore leave from the Empress of Britain, was pacing up and down, waiting for his fiancée, who worked in a nearby tobacconist and who he'd arranged to meet on the corner of Old Hall and Rigby Streets to take to the cinema. He was standing outside number 86, J.C. Bradfield & Co. sack and tarpaulin shop, when a sudden gust of wind caught hold of a wooden shutter on the shop front and sent it toppling down, striking Eves on the head. Apart from the shock of the blow, Eves was not injured, but the wooden shutter had damaged his derby hat he had purchased specially for his date. Moments later, a young man hurried from the shop to fix the shutter. Eves berated him about the damage to the new hat. The youth apologised and hurried back inside. Minutes later, another slightly older man came out, apologised for the accident, and after a short discussion, offered Eves 2 shillings to pay for the damage to his hat. Eves accepted the money and moved a little further down the street to continue his wait. 5 minutes later, the younger man came out of the shop pushing a cart. The older man followed, locked the door, and Eves watched as they headed off in the darkness towards Great Howard Street and the canals at Lockfields. On the following morning, typist Margaret Venables arrived for work and was shocked to find that although the shop had been opened, there was no sign of the manageress, 40-year-old Christina Bradfield. Already inside were the 2 staff, 22-year-old George Sumner and 18-year-old Samuel Eltoff. Catherine Bradfield, known to everyone as Kate, managed her brother's tarpaulin shop, and Margaret had last seen her on the previous evening when she and the 2 men were finishing off an order. When owner John Bradfield arrived a short time later, neither of the boys were able to help with the whereabouts of his sister. His suspicions were aroused when Ball claimed that Kate had given him the keys to open up, as she planned to be late in on the following day. He also noted that Ball had some scratches on his face and that some money seemed to be missing from the till. Bradfield thought it highly unlikely his sister would entrust the keys to the staff, and when she had not turned up by lunchtime, he contacted the police. An officer arrived at the shop and was told that on the previous evening, Margaret Venables had left work at 6:40 as usual and said that Miss Bradfield was still there in the warehouse with the two packers. A check on her movements found that Kate Bradfield had not returned to her lodgings in Birkenhead, but nobody at the house had thought anything untoward, as she often stayed with her brother. The shop closed early on Thursday and the staff left for home. Although suspicious that something may have happened, there was nothing in the way of evidence to suggest a crime other than some missing money, which could feasibly be with the missing manageress. Things were about to change considerably when later that afternoon a bargeman was having trouble navigating a lock on the Leeds to Liverpool canal. As Bradfield was speaking to a detective across the city, a bargemaster and his colleague discovered a strange bungle obstructing a locked gate. On closer examination, it was a heavy sack, and fishing it out, it was found to contain the body of a woman, trussed up with rope and weighed down with a large amount of scrap iron. Items found on the body suggested it was that of Kate Bradfield. An identification was soon complete when John Bradfield recognised items in the sack, and a visit to the mortuary confirmed that the body was that of his sister. A post-mortem carried out that evening found she had been battered to death with some type of blunt instrument. When the discovery of the body appeared in the evening paper, Walter Eves reported the incident with the falling shutter to the police. The statement made by Eves seemed to confirm their theories, and they decided to question again the two workers at their homes. Samuel Eltoff was picked up at his lodgings that night and taken into custody. When officers went to arrest Sumner, they found he had fled. Sumner, they discovered, was the youngest of 11 children, and his real name was George Ball. After a fallout with his family, he had changed his name and left home, and he was now missing. A search for the wanted man began in earnest, and John Bradfield put up a reward of £50, leading to his arrest. His photograph appeared frequently in the newspapers, and detectives were posted at railway stations and at the docks in case he tried to flee the area. For the first time, detectives used the increasingly popular Saturday morning cinema to reach a large audience. Before the matinee showing, a description of the wanted man was broadcast. Ball was described as 22 years of age, about 5'6" tall, a round face, clean shaven, dark brown hair with dark, heavy eyebrows, broad shoulders, slim build, slight scratch on his right cheek, level with his nose and on the left jaw, which may soon heal. He was dressed in a dark brown jacket suit, collar and tie, and a light check cap. Dark overcoat, well worn, and may have 2 or 3 buttons missing. Black lace boots, size 6, last seen at 8:10 on Thursday, 11th of December. Ball, however, was determined to keep one step ahead of the police. Mindful with the newspapers running the description of him, he changed his appearance. He shaved his eyebrows, donned an eye patch and glasses, and dressed himself as if he was an out-of-work sailor. Ball was to be at liberty for 8 days. He was a keen football fan, and on Saturday the 20th of December, his team Everton were playing Chelsea at the city's Goodison Park Stadium, and Ball was determined not to miss it. Believing his disguise was strong, Ball paid the admission fee and hoped to blend in amongst the 20,000 supporters on the terraces. The game ended a goalless draw, and as Ball left the ground, he was recognised amongst the crowd by an old school friend. Mindful of the money on offer for information leading to his arrest, Ball was traced to a lodgings on St James's Street. The man rushed to notify the police, and Ball was arrested later that night. When searched, he was in possession of a watch identified as belonging to Kate Bradfield, and his landlord testified that on the day after the murder, Ball had a significant amount of money when on the day before he had asked for a loan. With both in custody, detectives questioned each individually. From the outset, Eltoff claimed he was not present when the murder was committed, and had only helped Ball to dispose of the body. When he was scared, Ball would implicate him if he refused. He said they headed along Great Howard Street to the canals at Lockfields, where they then tipped the bundle off the cart and dragged it to the canal, flinging it into the murky water and watching it sink out of sight. The plan was that the canal would carry the body into the River Mersey, where it would be washed out to sea. Had the grim discovery not been made by a passing canal barge, detectives reasoned the killers may never have been brought to justice. They were remanded in custody at Walton Jail, and on the following day made their first appearance in court. They appeared before the stipendiary magistrate charged with the wilful murder of Catherine Bradfield. Counsel urged there was a prima facie case against both prisoners, and the crowded court heard the police solicitor outline the brief story of the case. Kate Bradfield was murdered on the night of Wednesday the 10th of December 1913 at the shop in Old Hall Street. Her body was then trussed up with rope, stitched into a sack along with some scrap metal and taken on a handcart through the streets before being thrown into a canal, where it was discovered on the following day. Eltoff and Ball were immediately suspected. Eltoff soon broke down and admitted he had helped Ball dispose of the body. Ball had disappeared from his lodgings and was finally tracked down 10 days later in possession of some items from the murdered woman. 4 police officers stood beside the prisoners in the dock, who newspapers noted maintained a cool and unconcerned demeanour. Evidence was given by a pathologist who said death was caused by concussion to the brain resulting from terrible blows on the skull. The injuries had almost certainly been caused by a marline spike. There was no indication of sexual outrage. A few weeks later, after a number of further remands, both were committed for trial, charged with willful murder. George Ball and Samuel Eltoff were jointly tried before Mr Justice Atkin at Liverpool Assizes on Monday the 2nd of February 1914. The case was to last for 4 days, and at the time one of the most sensational trials in the history of Liverpool. Mr Gordon Hewitt KC led for the Crown, with Ball defended by Alfred Tobin, who had valiantly defended Dr Crippen at the Old Bailey in 1910. John Singleton assisted Mr Hewitt, while W.J. Lees assisted Mr Tobin. Lyndon Riley defended Samuel Eltoff. The Crown claimed this was simply a murder for gain, and that after robbing his kindly employer, Ball had battered her to death, then tied her up in a weighted sack, thrown it into a canal and hoping the body would be washed out to sea. Walter Heaves, whose hat had been damaged by the shutter, told the jury he had seen the pair and the handcart. Ball and Eltoff both gave completely conflicting accounts of what happened that night. Eltoff said he'd been putting up the shutters outside the shop and had come back in to see a sneering Ball standing over the body of his victim, a bloodied piece of wood still in his hand. Ball claimed that an unknown man had committed the murder. He said he was in the packing room when a stranger entered. The man pulled out a gun, threatening Miss Bradfield, and when she refused to hand over the money in the till, he clubbed her to death. He then turned on Ball and threatened he would be shot if he didn't help dispose of the body by dumping it in the canal. Ball said he had no chance to escape and had been in fear of his life as he trussed up the body. The stranger then fled with the money. Ball said to Eltoff, "This looks bad for us," and he suggested they dispose of the body and try to bluff their way out of the situation. Terrified that Ball would turn on him, Eltoff was forced to help the killer dispose of the body in the canal. Under cross-examination, Ball's story collapsed. The prosecution claimed that Ball had ample opportunity to escape from the killer, none more so that when he had gone outside to speak to Walter Heaves about his damaged hat when the shutter had fallen on him. If Ball's version was true, he could have simply asked Heaves to call the police. There was other evidence suggesting Ball was the killer, including items of the dead woman being found on him, and with him being seen to have substantially more money that night in his lodgings than when he had gone to work earlier that day. Gordon Hewitt said it was scarcely possible to believe that Eltoff should have not known what was in the sack, as he had claimed when he assisted in taking it to the canal in the handcart. He suggested at the very least he was guilty of helping dispose of the body, knowing that Ball had committed the murder. On the fourth and last day of the trial, following the summing up of all the evidence, the jury retired at 4 o'clock. They returned shortly after 5, and the two men in the dock were told to stand up. Amid the tense silence, the clerk asked the foreman, "Do you find George Ball guilty or not guilty of murder?" "Guilty." Turning to the second man in the dock, "Do you find Samuel Angelis Eltoff guilty of murder?" "We find him an accessory after the fact, but ask for clemency of the court in view of his youth and in the belief that he was influenced by Ball." The clerk then turned back to Ball. "Have you anything to say why sentence to death should not be passed upon you?" Without the slightest trace of emotion in his voice, Ball replied firmly, "Only to say I am innocent." In reply to the clerk's question to Eltoff, he replied, "I am not guilty of felony or murder." After a few murmurings in the gallery, silence again fell over the court as the black cap was gently placed on the judge's wig. With the priest stood by his side, he addressed the dock. "George Ball, the jury have found you guilty of the crime with which you were charged, upon evidence which must have brought conviction to the mind of every reasonable being who has heard it. It was a cruel and heartless murder. Your victim had been good to you. She was kind to you, and you murdered her and did away with her body under circumstances which were revolting, but which, in your present position, I will not dwell upon. For your crime, the law knows but one penalty, and that penalty is death. In normal circumstances, the condemned prisoner would be removed from the dock before sentence of the second was pronounced. Mr. Justice Atkin had only been promoted to the bench in the previous year, and this was only the second time he had passed a death sentence. In what was more likely an oversight, Ball remained in the dock for several minutes, stirring around the court while the judge turned to address his partner in crime. You have been found guilty of a very terrible crime, that of assisting a murderer after the murder in concealing his crime. There can be very little doubt that you knew something of the crime, and it was your duty to your employer that you should have made the crime known. But you took an active part in helping the murderer to conceal the crime, and you have been party to dealing with the body, and you very nearly succeeded by your assistance in concealing altogether this terrible crime which was in fact committed. I have taken into account in the sentence I am about to pass the recommendation to mercy of the jury. I have taken into account your youth, and I take into account what no doubt may be true, that you have been contaminated by the influence of the man who stands beside you in the dock. But this is a very serious offence and must be treated seriously. The sentence of the court is that you be kept in penal servitude for 4 years. As the judge uttered the last words of the sentence, Eltoff's mother cried, "Oh, you brute," and then broke into floods of tears, sobbing loudly. Eltoff received his sentence without any outward sign of emotion, and at a sign from the warder, both men left the dock and went quietly below. Crowds of people had been waiting for hours in the vast square in front of St. George's Hall in order to hear the result. There was no recommendation for mercy, and Ball decided not to appeal against his conviction. He remained composed awaiting his fate, but it was reported that a farewell visit from his father and sister was very harrowing and difficult. Later that evening, Ball was visited by the Bishop of Liverpool, to whom he made a full confession. At 9 o'clock on Thursday the 26th of February 1914, as a crowd of over 2,000 gathered outside the prison gates, George Ball walked the dozen paces to the gallows, where he was hanged by John Ellis and assistant William Willis. While Ball was awaiting execution, Eltoff announced that he was to appeal against his sentence. On the following day, detectives went to his house, and following a search of his room, they discovered a quantity of money hidden in the knob of a metal bedstead. Believing it to have been stolen on the night of the murder, Eltoff was advised by his legal representative to withdraw his appeal or face a retrial with a potentially different and far more severe sentence. He decided to err on the side of caution, accepted his fate, and withdrew the appeal. Eltoff served part of his sentence in the same jail where his friend now lay buried, until he was later released to serve in the army. Following basic training, he was sent to France, where it was later recorded he was killed on active service. The fact George Ball confessed his guilt on the night before he was hanged shows that in his case justice was done. The question remains regarding his partner in crime. Had the money been found in Eltoft's bedroom before the trial, his part in the crime would have almost certainly seen him liable to the same fate as Ball. If he was complicit in the murder of Kate Bradfield, then his honourable death fighting for the king and country in France was a far more worthy one than the callous killer deserved. You'll be watching another tale of the Hangman's Record. Until the next time, thank you and goodbye.